3%. Let that number sink in for just a second. We're jumping right into this explainer today with a statistic that is, frankly, staggering. A lot of governments out there will tell you that 23% of our old-growth forests are still safely intact. But when you actually look at the peer-reviewed science, it paints a much darker picture. It turns out less than 3% of harvestable, ancient, old-growth forests are actually left on Earth. 3%. We are quite literally staring at the absolute brink of losing these entire ecosystems forever.
So, today we are going to dive deep into the global deforestation crisis. We're going straight to the front lines, all the way from the misty, temperate rainforests of British Columbia down to the dense tropical canopy of the Amazon rainforest. To make sense of this massive issue, we're going to break it down into 5 distinct parts. First, the value of ancient forests. Second, blockades and protest strategies. Third, the economics of logging. Fourth, exploring climate solutions. And finally, number 5, the need of the time. All right, let's jump straight into part 1, the value of ancient forests, focusing on biology and biomass. Because to truly understand what we're losing, we really have to wrap our heads around the biological miracles these ancient forests actually are. I mean, it is so much more than just a bunch of wood and leaves. Take the sheer scale of these organisms, which is just mind-boggling. A single western hemlock out in the Pacific Northwest has roughly 70 million needles. 70 million! If you were to take those needles and lay them flat on the ground, they'd create a photosynthetic surface 10 times the size of an entire football field. Because of this incredible density, these coastal forests hold 4 times the biomass of an equivalent acreage down in the tropics. They are literally unmatched giants. And, they aren't just isolated plants waiting around to be harvested either. They're actually a highly communicative family. Right beneath the soil is this thing called a mycorrhizal network. Think of it like a vast underground fungal internet, sometimes spanning hundreds of miles, where trees literally send chemical messages to each other. Ancient mother trees use this matrix to share carbon, water, and nutrients with struggling seedlings on the forest floor. They act as the ultimate stabilizers for the whole ecosystem. Now, if we zoom out from the Pacific Northwest and head down to the Amazon, we see that these old-growth giants are literally generating our global weather. They do this through a massive hydrological cycle that scientists call flying rivers. Basically, billions of trees pull water up from the earth and sweat it out into the atmosphere. This means that when you have fires and deforestation in the South American tropics, it directly leads to droughts and totally destabilized weather patterns in completely different hemispheres, impacting places as far away as Argentina, California, and the U.S. Rockies. Which brings us to part 2 of our explainer, blockades and protest strategies out on the front lines. So, as these irreplaceable weather makers and biological marvels start dwindling, everyday citizens are literally stepping right in front of heavy machinery. To understand why it's come to this, we need a little historical context. Logging in British Columbia has evolved a lot over the last 200 years. It started as slow, manual cutting back in the 1800s, but then the mid-20th century brought combustion engines and industrial machinery, which turned logging into this rapid, large-scale clearing process. That massive industrialization is what historically sparked the famous Clyakit Sound protests in the 1980s and 90s, where immense public pressure actually forced the creation of protected provincial parks. And that history laid the absolute strategic groundwork for today's Fairy Creek movement, which kicked off in August of 2020. Out there in the remote bush, this resistance takes the form of some highly tactical and, frankly, highly uncomfortable maneuvers. A major one is known as the sleeping dragon. Here's how it works. Organizers dig a deep hole into a logging road, cement a specialized heavy device into the ground, and then a protester locks their arm inside of it. They physically become part of the road, ensuring that police enforcement is drastically slowed down. They are literally buying the forest more time, one incredibly uncomfortable day at a time. And the human cost of this resistance is just immense. Over 1,100 arrests have been made at Fairy Creek by police enforcing court injunctions for the logging companies. People are walking away from their jobs, leaving their families, just to stand out there in the mud. Yet, even with a massive police presence, environmental photographers on the ground report that reinforcements continually arrive to take the place of anyone arrested. It has turned into a relentless war of attrition. But that's only half the story. Let's move to part 3, the economics of logging, looking at jobs, revenue, and rights. We have to be objective here, because the reality of resource extraction is never just a simple fairy tale of good versus evil. The friction between industry and ecology is massive. On one hand, forestry exports in BC accounted for $11 billion in 2020, supporting roughly 100,000 jobs. We are talking about real livelihoods here. When a mill shuts down, entire towns and families suffer. But on the other hand, the ecological costs are devastating. Industry practices like high grading mean that up to 50% of the logged wood is just left on the ground to rot. We lose vital carbon sinks, and those ancient, resilient forests get replaced by highly flammable monoculture tree farms.
And there's another layer of immense complexity here: First Nations rights. Neighboring tribes, like the Huayat First Nation under Chief Robert Dennis, are utilizing forestry revenues to emerge from decades of poverty and colonial injustice. They take $5 per cubic meter of logged wood and use it to fund the renewal of their local watersheds, which is bringing salmon back to rivers that were previously totally barren. Yet, at the exact same time, other traditional elders in those very same regions strongly oppose the cutting, viewing these ancient trees as sacred ancestors. It's this incredibly delicate, difficult balance of indigenous rights, economic survival, and ecological preservation. Now, let's shift back to the global scale for a second. The economics driving the destruction of the Amazon rainforest aren't primarily about lumber at all. It's actually about what is sitting on your dinner plate. The insatiable global demand for beef has resulted in cattle ranching destroying over 730,000 square kilometers of rainforest. To put that in perspective, that is an area larger than the state of Texas. And right alongside that, you have soy farming, which is mostly grown just to feed those very cattle. Between 2000 and 2019, soy cultivation doubled, clearing an area the size of France, often by using devastating scorched earth fire tactics. So, what do we do about all this? That brings us to part 4, exploring climate solutions, spanning from tradition all the way to cutting-edge tech. With the Amazon tragically transitioning right now from a carbon sink into a carbon emitter, governments and industries are scrambling. They're trying to figure out how to balance human economic needs with global survival. And the proposed solutions cover a pretty wild spectrum. On the traditional side, you have sustainable selective logging, like the Wildwood model, where you only harvest the necessary wood and leave the old-growth canopy and its genetic memory perfectly intact. Then you have market-based solutions, like carbon offsets, literally paying entities not to log. And finally, way on the other end of the spectrum, you have Silicon Valley biotechnology and genetic engineering. Now, it's important to note that these solutions are hotly contested. Environmental advocacy groups like Amazon Watch argue forcefully that market mechanisms like carbon credits are just false solutions. They argue these systems just create loopholes that allow major corporate polluters to essentially buy their way out of changing their actual destructive behaviors, letting a business-as-usual model continue while the forests keep burning. On the complete opposite side, the technological front, you have startups like Living Carbon. They believe we're past the point of just conserving what's left. They think we have to actively manage the biosphere by genetically modifying trees. Their whole goal is to create super trees that grow faster, pull heavy metals like nickel out of degraded soil, and critically resist fungal rot. I know it sounds like sci-fi, but they're intentionally trying to mimic the ancient Carboniferous period. That was a time millions of years ago when trees first evolved and drew down massive amounts of atmospheric CO2, drastically cooling a greenhouse Earth. But is tech enough? That brings us to our final section, part 5, the need of the time, which is a total paradigm shift. Because ultimately, scientists and experts suggest that high-tech genetic interventions and blocking logging roads won't save our biosphere on their own, not without a fundamental rewiring of our global culture. The renowned ethnobotanist Wade Davis points out that Western society currently operates on a purely extractive paradigm. We look at a forest, we calculate the annual allowable cut, and we just treat the planet's resources as quotas for industrial growth. He argues the urgent need of our time is to shift toward reciprocity. This is the profound understanding that the Earth gives us its bounty, and we, as biological beings on a finite planet, owe our fidelity and our active stewardship right back to it. Which leaves us with this. When you look at solitary, ancient giants like Big Lonely Doug, a magnificent 220-foot tree left completely stranded by itself in the middle of a clear-cut wasteland, we have to ask ourselves a pretty vital question. Will our descendants look back at our current economic policies and view them as a sheer act of folly? Or will we finally wake up, change our paradigm, and actually hear the forest fall before it's too late? Take that thought with you today. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll see you next time.